Welcome to Kitchen Politics. I'm Hampton Dellinger. Pleased to be here with Ruth Sheehan, Zack Hawkins, and Ken Lewis. How are y'all doing?
Doing great.
Great.
Well, Ruth, tell us what you've been doing of late.
Well, as you know, I was a columnist for many years at the News and Observer.
And a great columnist.
Well, you're kind. And now I'm off on a new adventure. I'm a rising second-year law student at Carolina Law.
Zack, how about you? Years in the classroom.
Years in the classroom. I taught for 3 years in Durham Public Schools. I lived in Durham for 10 and have making sure that everyone that needs help, gets it. So I'm working in the nonprofit sector right now.
And also some time on the campaign trails. What were you doing
absolutely.
in those years?
I think thrown David Price in there a few times and helped a lot of good people get elected.
And you were elected yourself as president of the Young Democrats of North Carolina?
For 2 terms. It was great, especially through the 2008 season, to see young people turn out in numbers that you wouldn't believe. So I absolutely enjoyed that time frame as president of Young Democrats.
And Ken Lewis, you spent time on the campaign trail. Remind us about that.
Well, as you know, in 2010, I ran for the U.S. Senate in the Democratic primary and had a great experience with that. After the primary, I became the chair of the Elaine Marshall campaign and continued campaigning for her through the general. I'm now practicing law in private practice in Durham.
Well, I'm practicing law myself, and I had a time in between Murphy and Manio as well, ran for lieutenant governor in 2008. And since then, I've also spent time in the media. I've got a weekly radio show, public policy, public interest show, Beyond the Headlines on WCHL 1360. And I've been looking ahead, thinking about what's to come in the policy and political arena. And I see 4 major events over the next 14 months in North Carolina. We've got the local elections to take place in September and October of 2011. We've got the statewide and congressional primaries in May of 2012. We've got the world watching us in the first week of September 2012 when the Democrat National Convention will be in Charlotte. And then we will have our own general election, including a presidential primary in November 2012. So I was thinking, who are some great thinkers to help me and others think through what's going to happen? And so I thought of y'all and said, come on down to the kitchen. And I really appreciate y'all doing it. But I think there are a few things that have happened recently that will provide context for what's going to happen in the future, probably most notably what happened in the General Assembly over the last few months. And there's been a lot of discussion, Zack, about the changes in education, both the movement of certain programs from the Department of Public Instruction to HHS like More at 4 and Smart Start, also the education cuts. You've been in the classroom. You've stood and delivered. What do you think about what's happened?
Well, when I was in the classroom for 3 years, Hampton, I only asked for a 50% shot. And, I think that's the best that any teacher is going to get.
And what do you mean by that? What's a 50% shot?
Students want to listen some days, and some days they don't. They're teenagers, and they have tons of external environmental issues that they're walking into the classroom with. The other 50% is whatever the teacher can do. And so every teacher, I think, is a great teacher and doesn't do it for the money, but does it because they believe in education and they want to see students move forward. And with the cuts, the more students that you add into the classroom, Hampton, the more you're skewing that equation because you can't manage 32 and 35 students as a teacher. The ideal classroom size of 20 is great. I think we talked about More at 4. You mentioned More at 4.
Yeah, how important is it when you were receiving these kids in junior high, middle school, and in high school, how much did it matter what they walked into the classroom with in terms of their reading comprehension, their mathematical aptitude? Were they set in stone?
No, absolutely not. And that's what's so devastating about the cuts to early education. Because if students are leaving early education or leaving elementary school on a 2nd or 3rd grade reading level, by the time they're in 8th grade, that means they're at 5th grade at best. And by the time they're in 9th to 12th, they're still maybe in a 6th grade reading level. So
and there's almost nothing you can do in high school?
Well, there is, and we try to do a lot of remediation, but that takes more staff. But meaning with the cuts that came down from the General Assembly, a lot of that support staff was cut.
Well, and also if you start, getting it on the front end, that's the critical moment,
That's
right?
the critical
That's
moment.
the easiest time to sort of get these kids ready and learning and
Yes.
eager to learn.
Absolutely.
As opposed to waiting till they've got the hormones racing and everything in middle school, right?
And that's and you have to think about it. If each of us have children, they're 5 years old, they put on the backpack, they're ready to learn, and so we have to do our best to provide the funds available to make that a great learning environment. And so that's why I'm just a little disappointed with those cuts, because walking into elementary school and in middle school, you have to have students that are prepared for a global society. And with the way that we're cutting and with not only more forward and smart start, but maneuvering it over to health and human services doesn't do them any favors.
And I always understood that the pivotal moment for so many kids is that period when they learn how to read. And if they have not, if not mastered, at least become very comfortable with reading by second and third grade, it starts a slide that as gifted as the teachers will be in middle school and high school is almost impossible to reverse.
That's true, because they become very disinterested.
They become embarrassed.
They're very embarrassed if students in phonics and asking students to read out loud becomes something that's very embarrassing.
And so they'll stop coming to class. They'll start acting out
Absolutely.
outside of class.
Suspension rates, North Carolina, North Carolina, I think, ranks maybe fourth or fifth in the country for suspension rates. And a lot of those students, mostly low-income students, have a very low reading comprehension.
Right.
And so I would love to see the graph that shows reading comprehension and how it relates to the rest of their academic achievement, because they haven't necessarily connected those lines, but most of the students that are being suspended have very low reading comprehension,
Right.
and academic performance.
Well, we all appreciate what you've done in the classroom. And Ruth, I know you've written a lot about women's issues, and there was also a lot of discussion in the past legislative session about reproductive rights.
There was too much discussion.
And for many women, I think in the state, too many changes. The decision of the legislature to mandate certain medical tests for pregnant women before they're able to decide whether they want to terminate a pregnancy, to require a 24-hour waiting period, to mandate certain discussions with their doctor, to really intervene in that doctor-patient relationship as it relates to a woman who is facing a crisis pregnancy. Mm-hmm. How do you view that issue, and what would you have been saying if you were continuing your column?
Yeah, one of the many issues, right? Interestingly, the bill that we're really talking about was called the Woman's Right to Know Bill, which I found sort of ironic because, for years as a reporter, we fought to get more records available, more right to know. The more you know, the better. In this case, it was an artifice, obviously, and I found it really appalling. I grew up Catholic in the Midwest, and I have really complicated feelings about abortion. I think most of us, though, don't want people to have unwanted pregnancies, and we don't want abortions. But the Constitution, the Supreme Court has protected that right. And if it's a constitutionally protected right, the idea that we're going to require women who've obviously already wrestled with these decisions to come in and jump through these hoops.
They know they're
really
pregnant.
Offensive. Right. They've made their decision.
They've thought about it. They've consulted their family, their conscience.
Right. And so to require them to wait an additional time period to listen to, to be forced to consider this additional information, and the information is it has a slant to it that may surprise you. So I think what's really surprising to me is that there hasn't been more of an outcry among women over that bill. Because it passed, the governor vetoed it, and obviously it was overridden.
Right.
So.
But, and I wonder about, people will always use these counterintuitive situations, and they'll say, well, would the budget crisis and the debt and default issue have been different if women were in charge, if it was Speaker Michelle Bachmann and President Hillary Clinton. And sometimes I think that is overdone, but I wonder on this issue of reproductive rights, if women were a majority in the legislature, whether there would have been a different debate and a different outcome. I don't know. We can't know.
I don't know, because, one of the things that the Republican Party did, because it was a Republican majority, obviously, that pushed this bill through, was they had women legislators out in front.
And a lot of men voting legislators behind them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the amazing things about this debate on reproductive rights is that much of the energy, that political energy that led to the Republican control of both houses was this Tea Party movement, which really one of the principal tenets of that movement is limited government, is keeping government at bay, a libertarian slant. And so it was ironic to me that once they gained control, that they went in the opposite direction, that instead of limiting government control, here they introduced a bill and pass a bill and override a veto, a bill that puts the government between a woman and her doctor and her conscience in making a decision. And it's just an ironic betrayal of the tenets that really fuel the Tea Party movement. And I think that bit of irony hasn't escaped me, and I think hasn't escaped many voters.
Have they explained how they reconcile the two, and limited government and making those types of decisions? I don't really hear many explanations.
Well, it's a good question. I think there are a lot of the current leadership in the General Assembly on the Republican side did not come up through the Tea Party movement. They predated it, so that they are empowered and in the majority, I think, in no small part from the energy generated by the Tea Party movement. But it's not that they were inculcated from the beginning, particularly on social issues. Well, Ruth, you mentioned the absence of discussion and outcry about the cutbacks in reproductive rights. And I wonder if in part that's because of the contraction in what's been often called the mainstream media, for lack of a better word. There have been so many layoffs at the local media outlets, in particular on the print side. Mm-hmm. And you talked about how the press room of the General Assembly has become a broom closet.
Oh, yeah. It used to be this teeming place. People used to have conversations with their bosses and throw the phones against the wall. Now, of course, phones are this big, but
and you always hear about
a little less impressive.
You hear about the press corps. It seems like it's just maybe a press cadet at this point. I mean, there's no corps left. But what do you think that's meant as a practical matter in terms of issues that have been undercovered or missed completely?
Yeah, well, this is something that I'm so concerned about, and I'm concerned about the newspaper industry for sure. But what I really, really am concerned about is what it means for our democracy, for the people, because they need to have the information. And there's so much of what has gone on down on Jones Street that there just isn't the manpower to cover it. And there are all kinds of things I don't think that we've even discovered yet. There's all sorts of little time bombs that I think that are going to be going off over the next 2 years as different pieces of legislation that have been approved go into effect, and we see what happens. There just used to be that the News and Observer, for instance, had at least a half dozen, probably more people down there. And now we have one person covering the legislature mostly full time, but
right.
Even then, she does some agency work.
Doing it for the news,
impossible.
Doing it for the News Observer and the Charlotte Observer. Of course, I remember when the Charlotte Observer and the News Observer competed against each other, and I think really drove each other to do investigative reporting in an extensive and in a very powerful way.